1873, Dodge City, Kansas. A man walks into a saloon with 3 weeks of wages in his pocket, and by morning, every cent of it is gone. He doesn't know what hit him, but the men who built that room knew exactly what they were doing. We've been sold a version of the frontier saloon that never quite existed. The swinging doors, the honest game, the rough but fair bartender who knew every man by name. That version is comfortable. It's also wrong, because the saloon wasn't a refuge from the hard life of the West. In most cases, it was the mechanism that made the hard life permanent. It was designed deliberately and carefully to take everything a working man had and leave him with nothing but a reason to come back. And if you think that sounds too deliberate, too calculated for the frontier, stay with us. Because the evidence is right there in the architecture, in the business records, in the complaints filed by miners and railroad workers and cattlemen who walked out of those places with empty pockets and no clear memory of how it happened. Welcome to Mystery Wild West. And today, we're going somewhere most history books won't take you. If this kind of history interests you, the real version, not the comfortable one, consider subscribing. We go deeper on the stories that get cleaned up before they reach the textbooks. And here's something to think about before we go further. Did you ever walk into a place and feel like the whole setup was designed to keep you there longer than you planned? Drop it in the comments, because what the Frontier Saloon did was not that different from what you might recognize today. Let's go back to the beginning. Not the mythology, the business model. A saloon in the 1860s or 70s was not a spontaneous gathering place. It was a calculated investment. The men who financed them weren't romantic figures. They were businessmen. Some were backed by larger interests in the East. Some were connected to the railroad companies that had just dumped thousands of workers into raw, unprepared towns with no infrastructure, no housing, and no place to go when the workday ended. The saloon appeared almost immediately after the workers did. That timing was not a coincidence. Think about what those men had. They had wages, not much, but consistent. A railroad laborer in the early 1870s might earn $1.25 a day. A miner on a good claim might pull in more, but often less, and never reliably. A cattle drover who'd spent 3 months walking a herd north from Texas arrived in a cow town with a few months of pay and nowhere obvious to spend it. The saloon was the most visible, most accessible, most socially acceptable place to be. Everything else in those towns was closed, unfamiliar, or designed for someone with a permanent address. The saloon was open. That was the first tool. Not just open during reasonable hours. Open all night, open on Sundays when other businesses shut, open on holidays, open in the rain. You could walk in with mud on your boots and a week of dust on your coat, and no one asked you to be different from what you were. That kind of unconditional availability sounds generous? It wasn't. It was a strategic removal of friction. Every hour they stayed open was another hour you might spend something. Here's the problem with that kind of availability. A man who is tired, far from home, and has nothing waiting for him in a rented bunk or a tent, that man fills his time where the time is easiest to fill. The saloon made itself the easiest place to exist, and once you were inside, the environment did the rest. The layout of a saloon was not accidental. Walk in the front, and the bar is right there, immediate. You don't have to commit to anything. You're just standing. You're just looking. But the bar is long, and there are other men along it, and the social pressure of not drinking while standing at a bar is considerable. You order something. The first drink is sometimes cheap, sometimes even free. Because the first drink is not the product. The first drink is the entry point. The back of the room held the tables, card games, dice, sometimes roulette in the more established places. Those tables were not placed at the back by accident. You had to walk through the room to reach them. You had to pass other men, hear the sounds of chips and cards, feel the momentum of the space pulling you further in. Every foot deeper into the room was another foot further from the door. The lighting was kept low, not for atmosphere, for function. It was harder to read faces, harder to track the time, harder to see exactly how many drinks had been poured or how much money had changed hands. Some saloons had no windows at all, or kept them shuttered even during the day. Inside that room there was no morning and no evening. There was only now. Time stopped being something you could measure, and when you can't measure time, you can't manage it. The noise was constant. Piano, if the place could afford one. Conversation engineered to be loud enough to fill the room, but not so overwhelming that you felt unwelcome. The human brain finds silence uncomfortable. Fill the silence with just enough familiar noise, and a tired man relaxes in spite of himself. Relaxed men make worse decisions. That was known even then, even without any formal study of the mind. The men who ran saloons knew it from experience because they watched it happen every night. And this is where things change, because what was actually being sold in those places was not always what it appeared to be. The whiskey was frequently not whiskey. That's not hyperbole. Dilution was standard practice in the less reputable establishments, and there were more of those than the other kind. A barrel of actual distilled whiskey cost real money to transport across difficult terrain to a frontier town. What cost far less was to stretch it. Bartenders added water, which was the mildest version of the practice. Others added tobacco, or burnt sugar, or pepper, or in some documented cases, actual chemicals, substances that mimicked the burning sensation of alcohol without providing much of the alcohol itself. The drinker felt like he was drinking. He felt the heat. He felt something happening. But he wasn't getting what he paid for. This matters for a reason beyond simple dishonesty. If the alcohol content in the drink was lower than expected, a man would drink more to feel what he came in to feel. More drinks meant more money spent. It also meant a longer stay. A longer stay meant more opportunities for additional spending. The dilution wasn't just theft. It was a mechanism for extending the session. A miner sits down after a shift. He's been underground for 10 hours. His back hurts. His hands are cut up. He orders a whiskey because it's the one thing he's been thinking about since noon. He drinks it. It doesn't hit quite the way it should, so he orders another. The bartender pours it fast, barely hesitating, because that's the job. By the third drink, the miner has spent more than he planned and still doesn't feel the way he wanted to feel. By the fifth, he's not thinking about the money anymore. That was the design. But it gets worse, because the card tables were a separate system entirely. Now, not every card game in every saloon was fixed. Some were honest games among working men who genuinely enjoyed cards and understood the odds. That existed. But in the more financially serious operations, the ones connected to the saloon's ownership, the ones where the house had a stake, the games were not fair. The mechanics of cheating were, by the 1870s and 80s, remarkably sophisticated. A professional card sharp working a frontier saloon was not a man relying on luck or even particularly on sleight of hand, though he had that too. He was operating within a system. Marked cards were common, marks that required special knowledge or particular eyesight to detect, invisible to a man 3 drinks deep in a poorly lit room. Second dealing which is the ability to deal the second card in the deck rather than the top one, had been practiced and refined to the point where it was nearly undetectable to an untrained eye. Cold decks, prearranged decks that the dealer would switch in at a critical moment in the game, could be introduced mid-session without any obvious movement. And here's the question worth sitting with. How would a drover from South Texas, who had spent the last 3 months on horseback, know the difference? He played cards around campfires. He played with men he trusted. He had never sat across from someone whose entire profession was this. He didn't know what to watch for. He didn't know there was anything to watch for. He walked in thinking it was a fair game, because the idea of a rigged game at that scale, a professionally maintained, owner-backed operation of deception, was outside his experience. The saloon knew that. It counted on that. Some establishments employed women for the purpose of encouraging men to stay and spend. This is often described in the romantic version as companionship or entertainment, but the economic function was specific. A man sitting with a woman at his side is a man who will order another round. He's also a man who's less likely to pay close attention to the cards. Female employees in some saloons were paid commissions on the drinks men purchased while in their company. They weren't hostesses in any neutral sense. They were part of the revenue system, and they operated under conditions that were frequently exploitative in their own right. The women weren't the trap. They were inside the trap along with everyone else. That distinction matters. A sheriff in a mid-sized cattle town in the early 1870s had a complicated relationship with the saloons on his main street. On one hand, they were the most likely source of the violence he was paid to control. Drunk men, rigged games, men who felt cheated, men who had lost everything and had very little left to lose. Those conditions produced violence reliably. On the other hand, the saloons were often the primary tax base for the town. The licenses they paid funded the sheriff's own salary in some cases. The town's entire economic structure sometimes rested on the revenue the saloons generated. So the sheriff patrolled. He managed the worst of it. He broke up fights, removed the most visibly problematic individuals, maintained a version of order. But he did not go after the structure. He couldn't, or he wouldn't. The lines between couldn't and wouldn't were often blurred in those positions. This is a pattern that repeated itself across the frontier in different forms. The men with the economic power to fund town infrastructure were often the same men profiting from the systems that stripped working men of their wages. The violence got policed. The business model that produced the violence did not. In some cattle towns, the saloon owners and the town council overlapped significantly. A man who owned a saloon might also sit on the board that determined local law, set licensing fees, and decided which kinds of businesses were allowed to operate. This was not exceptional. It was common enough to be expected, which meant the system that could theoretically have regulated the saloons was often populated by the same people who profited from them. That's not a conspiracy. It's just power arranging itself the way power does. Here's where the myth becomes important again. Because the way saloons have been remembered as rough but honest places, democratic and equalizing, where any man could pull up a chair, that memory does real work. It makes the exploitation invisible. It reframes a system designed to extract money from desperate people as a kind of freedom. You could go in there. Nobody turned you away. That felt like equality. But equality of access is not equality of outcome. Every man could walk through those swinging doors. The rules inside were not equal. The man behind the bar knew things the man in front of it didn't know. The man dealing cards knew things the men playing the cards didn't know. The house knew exactly how the architecture, the light, the noise, the timing, and the alcohol were all working together. The customer knew none of that. He thought he was just having a drink. Now think about the towns themselves. A railroad camp in the early expansion years might exist for months or even a year or two before any permanent civic infrastructure arrived. Schools came late. Churches came later. Newspapers took time. Law enforcement was thin and inconsistently funded. In that environment, the saloon was sometimes the only developed public space. It was where news traveled, where disputes got negotiated, sometimes violently, where work connections were made, where men went when they were sick of being alone, and because it served those functions, real functions, genuine social needs, it earned a kind of legitimacy. A space that does necessary things is hard to entirely condemn, even when it does harmful things alongside. The saloon threaded through the life of a frontier town because it filled gaps that nothing else filled. And while it filled those gaps, it also emptied pockets. A farmer arrives in a supply town after 2 months of isolation. He needs to buy seed and tools. He has cash from a modest harvest. The saloon is the most social place in town. He goes in. He has a drink because not having one would be strange. He plays a hand of cards because the men around him are playing. He's not a gambling man, not particularly. He just got pulled along by the current of the room. By the end of the evening, some of that seed money is gone. Not all of it, but some. And the next time he comes in from the farm, he goes back. Because the social experience was real, even if the fairness wasn't. That's the most difficult part of this to hold in mind simultaneously. The loneliness was real. The need for social contact was real. The relief of being in a warm, lit, populated room after weeks of isolated physical labor, that was genuine. And the system that met those needs was also the system that exploited them. Both things were true at the same time. You can't fully separate the comfort from the trap. They were built together. Now consider the men who ran these operations. They weren't uniformly villainous, whatever that would even mean in this context. Some were themselves working men who had found one of the few business opportunities available on the frontier that didn't require land or specialized skills. Starting a saloon required capital, but less than many other ventures. It required a space and a supply of liquid goods. The margins could be strong if managed well. For a man with limited options, it was a viable path. But viable path or not, the practices were what they were. Diluted goods, rigged games, engineered environments, these required choices. Someone chose to add the tobacco to the whiskey barrel. Someone chose to use the marked deck. Someone decided to shutter the windows. The system didn't build itself. Individuals made decisions, and those decisions composed the system. Some of those individuals were aware of exactly what they were doing and felt no particular conflict about it. Others operated with the kind of normalized dishonesty that exists in any industry where the practices are widespread enough to become invisible. If every saloon in town diluted its whiskey, then diluting your whiskey isn't a choice that stands out. It's just what saloons do. That normalization made reform nearly impossible from within the industry. There was no internal incentive to offer a fair game if your competitors weren't offering one. You'd simply attract the experienced players who knew they could win against you while they lost to everyone else. Let's talk about the debt structure, because this is where things got genuinely dark. Some saloons operated on credit. A man who ran out of cash could run a tab. The saloon kept the record. At some point, the tab needed to be paid. This was, in a surface sense, A service you could keep drinking when you were out of money. But the implications went further than that. A man in debt to a saloon had a reason to keep coming back even if he wanted to stop. He had a social obligation, a debt that needed servicing. And while he was there, servicing the debt, he was usually drinking and sometimes gambling more, which often meant the debt didn't shrink the way it should have. There are accounts from mining regions where men got so deeply into tab debt with the only saloon in a remote camp that the debt itself became a form of leverage. You didn't want to make enemies of a man you owed money to, especially in an isolated community where that man had connections and you were a long way from anywhere. The debt created a soft dependency that went beyond the chemical dependency that heavy drinking could produce on its own. A miner in a remote camp, winter setting in, 2 months from the nearest alternative, that man's relationship to the saloon that held his tab was not a free relationship. He was in there because there was nowhere else to go, and because he owed money, and because the cold outside was real, and because the alternative to the warmth and company of the saloon was a dark tent with nothing in it. The saloon didn't invent those conditions, but it took full advantage of them. And this is the question that should be sitting with you right now. If the people running these places knew what they were doing, and the evidence strongly suggests many of them did, then why did it work for so long without generating more organized resistance? Part of the answer is the nature of the workforce it was drawing from. Railroad laborers were transient. They moved constantly as the rail line extended. They were not settled in communities long enough to organize sustained opposition to any local institution. By the time they understood a place, they were leaving it. Miners were similarly mobile. Cattle drovers passed through once, twice a season at most. The workforce that the saloon most reliably targeted was the workforce that was least positioned to collectively push back. The men who stayed, the permanent residents, the merchants, the ranchers, had more complex relationships with the saloons. Some genuinely disapproved. Some were completely dependent on the spending that flowed through those places. A dry goods store in a cattle town did more business on the days the drovers came through than in the rest of the month combined. If the saloon attracted those men to town, the dry goods store benefited indirectly. The economic web was tangled. The temperance movement eventually reached the frontier, of course. It arrived with the church infrastructure that came in the later years of settlement. Women who had watched husbands and sons lose wages they couldn't afford to lose organized. Petitions were circulated. Dry counties were voted in. Some towns banned saloons entirely or heavily restricted their hours. But these efforts were chronically undermined because the men with the most financial investment in the existing system were also the men with the most political weight. A vote to go dry in a cattle town might pass among the settled population. The saloon owners would appeal. They'd argue economic necessity. They'd point to the lost tax revenue, the lost business traffic, the risk of the town being bypassed by the drives in favor of a wetter town down the road. Sometimes they were right about those economic consequences. Sometimes they manufactured the fear. The line was hard to find from inside the argument. And here's an uncomfortable reality. The towns that went dry early often did lose business traffic, at least temporarily. The economic argument was not always false, which meant the choice between moral reform and economic survival was sometimes a real choice, not a manufactured one. That is a genuinely difficult position for a community to be in. Choose your conscience and lose revenue. Choose the revenue and maintain the system. Some communities found middled solutions. They restricted hours. They banned certain games. They required licenses and created fines for violations. The fines became a revenue stream in their own right, which created a perverse incentive to maintain the violations rather than eliminate them, because eliminating them would eliminate the income from the fines. This is not a fictional dynamic. It appears in actual municipal records from the period. The architecture of the saloon extended outside its four walls. It shaped the towns it operated in. It influenced the law. It influenced the politics. It influenced the economy of the surrounding region because of where the wages ended up. Consider a cattle drive arriving in a shipping town in the mid-1870s. Several dozen men paid off at the end of a long drive. That collective wage represented real capital, money that had come up from the South and was now available in this particular community. In an ideal scenario, some of that money would circulate, spent on goods, on food, on equipment, leaving the town economically enriched by the visit. Some of it did circulate that way. But a significant portion went into the saloon economy, the bar tabs, the card games, the various fees and losses associated with that environment, and that portion was far less likely to remain in the broader community. It accumulated. It went to ownership. And ownership, in many cases, meant outside interests, men who had financed the operation from elsewhere and collected returns. So the drovers' wages traveled up from Texas. They passed through the saloon, and some portion of them traveled further east to financiers who had never set foot on a cattle trail and never intended to. The frontier looked rough and decentralized. The money flow told a different story. We talk about the Wild West as a place of radical independence. Every man with a gun and a horse and room to move. That image isn't entirely wrong. There were forms of freedom in that environment that didn't exist in the more settled, more institutionalized East. But freedom from what? There were still systems, still economic structures that concentrated benefit at the top, still mechanisms that moved money from those who earned it with their bodies to those who had constructed the conditions under which it was spent. The saloon was one of the most effective of those mechanisms, and it was disguised as leisure. The man who lost his wages in a saloon didn't always feel like he'd been robbed. Sometimes he felt like he'd had a good night or a bad night, or a night that was simply over. The experience was real. The drinks went down, even if they were cut. The cards were dealt, even if the deck was cold. The laughter happened, even if it was happening inside a machine. The memory of the evening wasn't always a memory of loss. Sometimes it was a memory of company, of noise, of being somewhere rather than nowhere. And that's what made it work for as long as it did. The product was genuine human experience. The cost was hidden inside that experience. You paid for something real with something real, and the exchange was not what it appeared to be. A railroad worker in the 1880s, heading into a saloon in a boom town somewhere in the territories, he wasn't a fool. He knew in a general sense that the house had an advantage. He knew the odds weren't in his favor. He'd probably heard stories. But knowing a thing in the abstract and feeling it in the moment are different things. In the moment, he was warm. He was among people. He had a drink in his hand. The music was going. The night was not yet over. The knowledge that the odds were against him didn't feel urgent. It felt theoretical. And theoretical dangers are easy to set aside when the alternative is going back to wherever you were sleeping. The saloon made itself the better option. That was its deepest function, not entertainment, not socialization in any neutral sense, but the construction of a comparative situation in which spending money in that room was always more appealing than not being in that room. As long as that was true, The system ran itself. Now, this raises a question worth holding on to as we continue. Did the men who built these systems understand what they were doing in moral terms, or did they simply understand it in practical terms? Did they think of themselves as predators, or did they think of themselves as businessmen who had found an efficient market? The answer is almost certainly the latter, and that matters. Because systems that are maintained by people who don't think of themselves as doing anything wrong are harder to change than systems maintained by people who know they're doing something wrong and are hiding it. If the saloon owner genuinely believed he was providing a service, genuine entertainment, genuine hospitality, genuine social space, then the practices he maintained were just operational efficiency to him. The diluted whiskey was cost management. The marked cards were protecting his investment in a risky business. The architecture was just good design. None of that is true, but it's how a man can sustain a practice across a career without being consumed by guilt about it. The story you tell yourself about your own work shapes what you're able to see about it. And the man who told that story often also told it to his customers, at least implicitly. This is a fair place. Come in. You'll be treated right. The whole performance of frontier hospitality, the bartender who remembered your name, the free drink on your birthday if someone mentioned it, the willingness to let a man run a small tab, all of that was the narrative layer over the mechanism beneath. The warmth was real. The exploitation was also real. Holding both of those simultaneously is the only honest way to see it. The legal environment around saloons on the frontier was chaotic and inconsistently applied. Territorial law was often weak or non-existent in its early stages. Federal oversight was thin. Local enforcement, as we've discussed, was compromised by economic dependency. In this environment, practices that would have been legally actionable in a more established legal context, fraud, deceptive trade practices, in some cases theft, operated without meaningful consequence. A man who believed he'd been cheated at cards had limited recourse. He could fight about it, which risked his own life and almost certainly would result in his removal from the premises by force. He could complain to the sheriff, who might record the complaint and do nothing about it, or who might be quietly connected to the saloon owner. He could leave town, which was often his plan anyway. Or he could do nothing, which was what most men did, because the practical options were all worse than absorbing the loss. The legal gap was not incidental to the business model. It was part of it. The saloon operated in spaces where enforcement was weak, because those were the spaces where the workforce was. The mining camps, the railroad towns, the cattle shipping points, all of them shared the same characteristic of thin legal infrastructure. And in thin legal infrastructure, the entity with the most economic and social weight was the entity that set the practical rules. In a company mining town, the situation could be even more concentrated. A mining company that owned the rights to the land sometimes also owned or licensed the only saloon in the camp. The workers paid the company for the privilege of working. They spent some of what they earned in a company-owned or company-adjacent establishment. Some portion of their wages went in a near-direct circuit back to the entity that had hired them. The extraction was almost elegant in its efficiency. This arrangement was common enough in some mining regions to have a name among workers, the truck system or some variant of it. You weren't always paid in cash. You were paid in credit redeemable at company-affiliated establishments, which meant you couldn't spend your wages anywhere but the places the company had an interest in. The saloon in those environments wasn't just a trap. It was a built-in feature of a closed economic system. A miner who tried to spend his wages elsewhere, or who sent money out of the camp to his family without going through the established channels was making a small act of economic resistance. Some did. It required finding ways to get actual cash rather than company credit, which wasn't always possible, and it required a willingness to operate outside the expectation of the community, which in a small, isolated camp was socially expensive. The social cost of resistance is worth dwelling on. Humans are social animals. Isolation is genuinely painful. A man who doesn't drink in a saloon community, who doesn't play cards, who refuses the particular social rituals of that environment, he's marking himself as different. Different is uncomfortable. Comfortable is being one of the men, being present, participating. The social pressure to participate in the saloon culture was not a minor thing. It was not a personal weakness to succumb to it. It was a predictable human response to the conditions that had been constructed. This is the part of the history that gets lost most completely in the romantic version. The saloon isn't just a place where bad decisions were made. It's a place where the conditions for certain decisions were carefully arranged. The individual at the bar wasn't operating in free space, making free choices with full information. He was operating inside a designed environment with incomplete information, social pressure, altered senses, and no good alternative. The choice to spend wasn't free in the way a genuinely free choice is free. It was free in the narrow sense that no one was physically forcing him to stay. But freedom, that narrow, isn't much freedom at all. And here's where we arrive at the final question worth sitting with. What happened to these places? The frontier didn't last forever. The railroad towns stabilized into regular towns. The cattle drives ended when barbed wire parceled up the open range and refrigeration changed where the beef industry concentrated. The mining booms went bust, as booms do, and the camps either became ghost towns or consolidated into actual communities with actual civic infrastructure. As communities stabilized, the conditions that made the saloon so powerful began to change. The transient male workforce that had been the primary target was replaced by settled families with different social structures. The church came. The school came. Women's civic organizations came. The social alternatives multiplied. And with alternatives came leverage, the ability to choose differently without the same cost that choosing differently had carried before. The temperance campaigns of the later 19th century and the eventual push toward prohibition were not simply moral crusades by people who didn't understand how men relaxed. They were in significant part a response by people who had watched what the saloon system did to the men in their communities over decades. Wives, mothers, daughters, they had the clearest view of the economic consequences because they were the ones trying to manage households on wages that had been partially consumed before they ever came home. The reform movement had its own problems, its own blind spots, its own failures of implementation. Prohibition itself was a catastrophe in a different set of ways, but the anger that drove it was not irrational. It was based on an accurate assessment of what the system had been doing. The saloon, in its frontier form, died, not all at once, not cleanly, but it died. The boom towns that had sustained it were replaced by settled communities that didn't need the same kind of space. The workforce that had fed it dispersed or found different options. The legal environment caught up, slowly, unevenly, but eventually with enough force to make the most aggressive practices unsustainable. What didn't die was the underlying pattern, the designed environment, the removal of time cues, the social pressure to stay, the architecture that guides behavior without announcing that it's doing so, the combination of real human need, the need to belong, to be somewhere, to feel something, with a business model designed to extract maximum value from that need. That pattern survived the frontier. It just moved to different rooms. But that's a different story. The saloon was real. The men who built it were real. The workers who lost their wages in it were real, and their losses were real. And the families who went without because of those losses were real. The architecture that was designed to make a man stay longer than he intended was real. The whiskey that was cut with things that had no business being in a glass was real. The cards that were marked in ways a tired man couldn't see were real. The romance was a layer painted over all of that, a very effective layer, durable enough to last 150 years and counting. But it was paint. Under it, the wood is what it always was.